Full crowd here tonight. So good to see you all. What a special occasion. Thank you all for coming. Welcome to the Athenaeum. I'm Heather Anticall, the Dean of the Faculty, and I want to thank you for joining us for a very special program honoring Professor Ed Haley and his years of scholarship and dedication to the CMC community and beyond. Ed's prolific career as a teacher and scholar spanned nearly half a century at CMC, and he made a profound difference in our community. He was an invaluable mentor and professor for more than 4 generations of CMC students and a key figure in the development of CMC's International Relations Program and in the founding of 2 CMC research institutes, the Keck Center for International and Strategic Studies and the Memoriam Center for Human Rights. Ed passed away on June 30th, 2023, at the age of 83. And this evening, we will be honoring his impact and his legacy here at CMC. Before we begin, I would like to especially thank Ed's family for being here. His wife, Elaine, his daughters, Kate and Blythe, and son-in-law, Keith, who I don't see right now, but oh, there he is. Nice to see you. As well as the many friends and colleagues of Ed's who made the trip to Claremont today to honor and remember such a distinguished member of CMC's faculty. We look forward to sharing with you some favorite achievements, memories, and highlights of Ed's service to CMC, and the many ways in which his legacy lives on here among his family, his friends, and generations of CMC students. Later, we will honor Ed's scholarship when we welcome CMC government professor Lisa Koch to the stage to deliver tonight's keynote lecture on the challenges and threats we face in this nuclear age. While she and Professor Haley never overlapped here as colleagues, Professor Koch's expertise in the fields of American foreign policy, nuclear warfare, security studies, and international relations align well with Ed's focus on U.S. foreign policy, specifically U.S. policy in the Middle East, U.S.-European relations, and nuclear safety and arms control. We are delighted to feature her in the program this evening. For those of you who are current students, you never had a chance to take a course from Professor Haley. However, you're all reaping the rewards of his steadfast dedication to this college, and in particular, the government and IR programs, to CMC's research institutes, and to many extracurricular programs. For the many faculty and staff here tonight who knew and worked with Ed, you will recall the numerous ways in which he touched this community and the care with which he treated his colleagues and his students, many of whom remained lifelong friends once they became alumni, joining advisory boards, attending programs, and visiting campus to keep in touch with him. Ed's tenure at CMC was long. He joined the CMC government department as a faculty member in 1968, embarking on a career that spanned 47 years here at the college. Ed chaired the International Relations Program and eventually became the W.M. Keck Foundation Professor of International Strategic Studies. Under Ed's leadership, the IR program grew and flourished and is currently one of the most popular majors at CMC, including many of you here in the room this evening. In 1984, Ed was named the first director of the Keck Center for International and Strategic Studies, establishing a library and teaching and researching international politics, international economics, defense and military affairs, and strategic studies. After stepping down as director, Ed continued to be involved with the center, later serving on the Keck's Board of Governors. Ed believed that CMC needed a center dedicated to the study of the Holocaust, genocide, and human rights. And so in 2003, he became one of the first advisory board members of another CMC research institute, now known as the Memoriam Center for Human Rights. 5 years later, in 2008, he became the director and worked tirelessly to ensure the center's long-term viability. Under his directorship, the center expanded key programs, including its speaker series and summer internship program. Ed's scholarship and knowledge in the field of international and strategic studies was equally matched by his stalwart support of the human rights causes around the globe. Upon his retirement in 2014, an endowed internship was established by the center's advisory board in Ed's name. The P. Edward Haley Internship currently supports CMC students studying conflicts and human rights issues in the Middle East, allowing them to travel there and conduct work during their summer months. In this and many other ways, his legacy of empowering students to combat threats to human rights around the globe by drawing on the lessons of history will long survive him. In addition to his work in the IR major and the institutes, Ed also conducted research with members of the US Senate and House of Representatives and was a prolific publisher of academic works. His books include Strategic Foreign Assistance, Civil Society and International Security and Strategies of Dominance, The Misdirections of US Foreign Policy. His book, Revolution and the Intervention, The Diplomacy of Taft and Wilson with Mexico 1913 to 1915, won the Premio Sahagún, which was awarded by the Mexican National Institute of Anthropology and History. Perhaps most relevant to tonight's keynote lecture by Professor Koch is a book he co-edited in 1988 titled The Nuclear Strategy, Arms Control and the Future. It is with great pleasure that I now hand the floor to Professor Hilary Apple, the Podluck Professor of Government and Director of the Keck Center for International and Strategic Studies, to share some brief remarks.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. As Heather said, my name is Hilary Apple. I've been a professor here for 24 years in the Government Department in the International Relations Program, and I'm currently the director of the Keck Center for International and Strategic Studies. That's the center that Ed was the founding director many years ago. And I'm grateful to be part of this event tonight, which honors the memory and the legacy of Ed Haley, my dear former colleague and friend. The Keck Center and the Magrublian Centers thought about wanting to create an academic event this evening at the Athenaeum on a topic that would be closely related to Ed's research and teaching interests. And that's why Lisa Koch, our award-winning international relations professor, will be speaking about her research later tonight. She is the continuation in many sense of the kinds of programs that Ed started here, because she teaches the courses that Ed introduced to our curriculum many years ago. So it's really terrific to be able to have this academic evening thinking about what Ed has created here. While Ed was at CMC, he had enormous productivity. He was a great scholar with many books and articles, but he was also a beloved teacher and an especially impactful leader on campus. When he retired, as Dean Antikal said, he left behind, he left behind 2 institutes and a thriving major and a community that much stronger for the contributions that he made to it. Now, he was also a very important voice in the government department for decades. He was very engaged. He was very committed. He was motivated by the strength of his convictions. So he was a very important member in the government department as well for all of those years. Generations of government and international relations students look back with fondness and gratitude for his education and for his mentorship. His lectures were particularly memorable because he infused them with his passion and his curiosity for the world. So anybody who knew Ed knew he was a voracious reader, right? And he read very broadly. He was a Renaissance man. And as a result, his classes benefited from that breadth of knowledge, for that passion for learning, and for his appreciation of opera, theater, poetry, the arts. And all of this informed the way that he taught. So some of his students would tell me in the 12, 13 years we overlapped, how his classes worked. He would incorporate into his foreign policy classes the libretto from operas, lyrics from songs, references to history, to art, to poetry, as well as IR theory and comparative politics. And his classes also reflected his deep humanity and his compassion. I had heard stories from students about a particular class that he held in which he decided to honor every soldier who had died in the war in Afghanistan by reading each name throughout the entirety of the class. And by the end of the class, everybody was in tears. Everybody was in tears. That stuck with those students, and this is the way he taught. He taught in a way that was very broad, that was very compassionate, and his honoring of those soldiers brought home the human cost of the war. And Ed, as you know, served in the US military. He served in the Army, and that's actually quite unusual for academics, even among professors of international security. So he brought that to the classroom in a way that was very important and very special. Beyond the classroom, Ed was an advocate for international experiences. He wanted his students to experience the world, and he encouraged study abroad in a very strong way. He encouraged international internships, cross-cultural exchanges. This was very important to Ed, and in a sense, Ed was an advocate for global education well ahead of his time, well ahead of his time. But closer to home, Ed knew quite a bit about creating community, quite a bit about creating community. He was so important in inviting his international relations students to his house. He invited all the majors at the first couple of weeks of classes over. He invited IR colleagues broadly across the different departments and across the whole consortium. And those evenings were lovely. Those receptions were so much fun. We had such wonderful dinners that he and Elaine would host. They were such gracious hosts, so warm, and they were a little mischievous too, in fact. I don't know if some of you remember where Elaine was a lot of the mischief too, with that 3-foot fork that you would steal people's food at the other end of the table. So they were always great fun. But there were also these intellectual soirees, this time for great discussion, great ideas, great debates, and I remember them with such fondness. And we miss Ed. He was such a community builder. We at CMC are truly, truly lucky that he was at the center of our community, and we miss him dearly. Thank you.
If Ed was here right now, he would actually tell you to stop eating your dinner and to eat your dessert first, because there might be an earthquake. That was how he started most of these dinner parties that Hillary just referred to, and that I will share with you a little bit more in a few moments. Thank you, Heather and Hillary, both, for sharing your comments and your reflections on Ed's impact here at the college. My name is Kirsty Zitter, and I'm the Assistant Director at the McGrublian Center for Human Rights, and I've had the pleasure of working with Ed there for 3 years, from 2011 until he retired in 2014. This year, we've been celebrating our 20th anniversary at the center. Fortunately, our founding director, Professor John Roth, had the insight to invite Ed to serve on our first advisory board, knowing that Ed's knowledge and expertise in international studies, combined with his dedication to the promotion and the defense of human rights, would be exactly what this new institute would need. Professor Roth was right, and in fact, 5 years later, as you heard, Ed became the director of the center in 2008. Some of his early successes include securing a prominent space for the center on CMC's campus, quite literally as he battled for prime real estate in the then new Kravis Center. I'm often told that I have one of the best views on campus, so thank you, Ed, for my amazing office. But Ed also worked tirelessly to help ensure the center's long-term viability. and to provide opportunities that offered the greatest impact to CMC students. As you've already heard, he did this primarily through his promotion of international study abroad and the internship programs, securing opportunities with leaders in the human rights field, including Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and others, so that future generations of CMC students would have consistent access to summer internship opportunities and could truly learn by doing in the field. I have many memories of working with Ed at the center, but given that I only have a few minutes tonight, I'd like to make my comments a little bit more personal. Because while I enjoyed working with him as a colleague, my husband Kevin and I were also lucky enough to be his and Elaine's neighbors on 7th Street, where our front porches literally faced each other. So when we weren't in the office, meeting with students, researching a famine in Somalia, or possibly the humanitarian crisis unfolding in Syria, we were neighbors and we were friends. I recall many weekend mornings that started off with a wave across the street as Ed was peeling out of his driveway headed for an early morning golf game, or in Elaine's case, an early Zumba class at the club. My kids trick-or-treated at their house. Elaine always had her electric blue wig on and greeted them at the door. My kids also frequently shared details of their school days or fascinating facts about garden snails or the results of their Saturday soccer games. For many of us, Ed and Elaine filled the role of surrogate neighborhood grandparents, and the kids on 7th Street were the lucky recipients of that. And then there were the dinner parties. Hillary already mentioned this as well, and many of you here tonight will know what I'm referring to when I say that the Haleys hosted the best dinner parties. The food was amazing, the wine was perhaps even better, and Ed and Elaine always put a lot of thought into who was together in the room, hoping perhaps to connect people to new friendships or to balance out the opinions that might surface later on in the conversation. But there was also the house rule that you never sat next to the person that you came with. So if tonight you are not sitting next to someone that you know or someone that you arrived here with, please know that Ed would be smiling at that. I think the best thing, though, about these dinners was that at some point, Ed would switch into professor mode, which Hillary so wonderfully described in her remarks. He would share his insights on whatever current event or hot topic was circulating in the news, perhaps a geopolitical conflict, a human rights issue close to home, domestic politics, scary, or maybe sports. Regardless of the issue, he was competent and he was well-spoken, and although at times he could also get a little bit animated. Even after they moved north to Palo Alto, he was often the person whose opinion I sought when things were really divisive or unsettled in the world. Though, of course, my inquiries now came via email instead of across the dinner table. Nonetheless, he had a way of explaining things that didn't necessarily give you the answer, but that left you feeling that you at least better understood the history, the nuances, and the challenges that lied ahead and should be considered. I sure wish he was here now to provide those insights in his eloquent but determined manner, because I think we would all learn a lot. Ed was an intellectual, but he was also, as Hillary mentioned, a Renaissance man, and he was well-versed in the arts. In fact, in his retirement, Ed published 5 books of poems in the span of about 6 years. He also taught poetry and gave lectures in the community where he and Elaine lived, sometimes stepping in last minute to deliver an impromptu 45-minute state-of-the-world presentation, true story, we learned this from Kate last night, to the community members of their home. I have no doubt that their new neighbors benefited from those moments when Ed was in professor mode, and I sure hope that they enjoyed a few dinner parties as well. You'll notice at your tables tonight that there is a poetry book displayed in the center. It is one of the 5 that Ed published, and we hope you'll enjoy looking through it, perhaps reading some aloud to your table mates or quietly to yourself. And tonight, before you leave, one of you will get to take that book home, the person whose birthday is closest to Ed's, which is October 15th. So please sort that out amongst yourselves, and we hope you enjoy the small token of Ed's art and his voice. There is also a candle at each place setting, which each of you are welcome to take. It is symbolic of the 20 years of our center and the 20 years since Ed first joined our advisory board, helping to grow this institute into what it has become today. We hope that you enjoy the candle, and perhaps you'll think of Ed when you light it, because quite simply, Ed was lovely, and he brought a bit more light and a bit more warmth to all of us who were lucky enough to know him. I am pleased now to welcome Blythe, Ed's daughter, to share with you some of her reflections and also some of her dad's poetry. Thank you.
Our family is so grateful to the college, and particularly the Magrublian and Keck centers, for these remembrances. My dad loved this school. He found great meaning in his lifetime of work here. As you've heard in his retirement, he also spent a lot of time writing poetry, self-publishing 5 books. Many of his poems address the duality of beauty and suffering in this world. We humans are at the mercy of time and each other, his poems taught us. But beauty and love for each other, beauty in art and in nature surround us, offering us hope and respite. As you might imagine, these sentiments perfectly capture our grief at my dad's passing and our gratitude for the love and beauty that he brought to our lives. I'll share 2 poems with you this evening that he wrote. The first of which is entitled, Looking Back. Looking back, we found magic in roses, the petals falling around us in gentle sprays, sere brown fields, long grass nodding. Welcome to sunrise, sunset, moons of every size, every shape, to ever-present stars, ever-constant stars in our games made of the odds and ends of our brief lives. What did we really know but the play of day and light, our eyes opening on this world? Our world, our rich, unchanging world, was heaven, and we came to know it looking back. This next poem is called Beauty Never Insists. Beauty never insists. It lives gently in clouds that fill the air with gray and silver below white, above deep blue, where we expect it, in paintings, the gestures of dancers, and when it surprises us. It's summer. The hills have burned a deep radiant gold, stained by oaks that spread ragged patches of green. The foothills, the trees, the amber grasses rise toward the crest. Beauty protects us, not against the night, but against nothing but the night. I'd like to close with lines from a poem by Adam Zagajewski, a Polish poet whom my dad admired and who he allowed himself to be influenced by. As in my dad's poems and in the way he conducted himself in life, Zagajewski responds personally to the injustices of the world and compels us to celebrate beauty as a way to counteract the darkness in life. This is Try to Praise the Mutilated World by Adam Zagajewski. Try to praise the mutilated world. Remember June's long days and wild strawberries, drops of rosé wine, the nettles that methodically overgrow the abandoned homesteads of exiles. You must praise the mutilated world. You've seen the refugees going nowhere. You've heard the executioners sing joyfully. You should praise the mutilated world. Remember the moments when we were together in a white room and the curtain fluttered. Return in thought to the concert where music flared. You gathered acorns in the park in autumn and leaves eddied over the earth's scars. Praise the mutilated world and the gray feather a thrush lost, and the gentle light that strays and vanishes and returns. Thank you. My sister Kate will now share some poems as well.
As my sister Blythe said, my father loved this school. He loved each and every one of you, even if you never met. And I have to say that to the students in the room who may not have known my father would say that I was remiss if I did not tell you that if you should travel to Eastern Europe, Germany, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia have the best beer in the world. My poem tonight is In Lieu of Flowers by Shauna LeMay. A few years ago, I read a friend's father's obituary on Facebook. His father had requested, in lieu of flowers, please take a friend or a loved one out to lunch. Although I love flowers very much, I will not see them when I am gone. So, in lieu of flowers, buy a book of poetry written by someone still alive. Sit outside with a cup of tea, a glass of wine, and read it out loud, by yourself or to someone, or silently. Spend some time with a single flower, a rose maybe. Smell it, touch the petals, really look at it. Drink a nice bottle of wine with someone you love, or champagne, and think of what John Maynard Keynes said, my only regret in life is that I did not drink more champagne. Or what Dom Perignon said when he first tasted the stuff, come, quickly, I am tasting stars. Take out a paint set and lay down some colors. Watch birds. Common sparrows are fine, pigeons too. Geese are nice, robins. In lieu of flowers, walk in the trees and watch the light fall into it. Eat an apple, a really nice big one. I hope it's crisp. Have a long soak in the bathtub with candles, maybe some rose petals. Sit on the front stoop and watch the clouds. Have a dish of strawberry ice cream in my name. If it's winter, have a cup of hot chocolate outside for me. If it's summer, a big glass of ice water. If it's autumn, collect some leaves and press them in a book you love. I would like that. Sit and look out a window and write down what you see. Write some other things down. In lieu of flowers, I would wish for you to flower. I would wish for you to blossom, to open, to be beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you all for those lovely remarks about Ed Haley. It sounds like he was a wonderful man. We'll now have a 15-minute break before we move into our keynote speaker, Professor Lisa Koch. So please feel free to use this time to use the restroom. We have a guest book outside that we'd love all of you to sign in the lobby. So feel free to use these 15 minutes however you wish, and then we'll be moving into our keynote speaker. Have a lovely evening.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Marion Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Adrian Flynn, and I'm one of your Athenaeum Fellows for this academic year. With plenty of time for chatter later, I promise. So a common theme here tonight seems to be gratitude, and seeing as this is our last official Ath program of the semester, on behalf of my fellow fellows, Henry Long and Angie Zhao and Bilge Tayar, who cannot be here tonight, I want to take a second to extend so much gratitude to the incredible people leading the Ath, Brian, Byron, Ashley, Chef Cheeto, and all of our staff who have really stepped up to the challenges that our changes in leadership brought this semester. It's been an incredible autumn of Ath programming, and thanks to Dean Anticol, Professor Apple, Ms. Zitter, and Professor Haley's daughters, Blythe and Kate, tonight has certainly been quite the cherry on top. So I'm told that, rather unsurprisingly, Professor Haley was an Ath aficionado. Our resident Ath library scientist and part-time director, Brian Davidson, told me that Professor Haley spoke at the Ath 15 times between 1983, 40 years ago when this current building opened, and 2014 when he retired. For our keynote speaker, Professor Lisa Koch, tonight will be her first Ath talk. But based on the support for her cutting-edge research and immense popularity among students, I think that mark is well within her reach. Professor Apple was quoted this summer as saying that a thriving international relations major is one of Professor Haley's most important CMC legacies. And as an IR student and vice president of the Claremont International Relations Society, I can personally attest to Professor Haley's legacy being in very good hands with our stellar IR program, of which Professor Koch has certainly become a cornerstone since arriving in 2016. And for what it's worth, the president of the International Relations Society is also here, and I understand that she would most likely share this view. Professor Koch is Assistant Professor of Government and teaches Introduction to International Politics, Foreign Relations of the United States, U.S. National Security Policy, as well as her specialty, International Politics of Nuclear Weapons. Her work on nuclear proliferation and international security has been widely recognized and commended. She is a 2021 Stanton Foundation Nuclear Security Grant Program winner and has also received research funding from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. This year, she published her first book, Nuclear Decisions, Changing the Course of Nuclear Weapons Programs, with Oxford University Press. For students in the room, these various accomplishments are no surprise because Professor Koch is simply a phenomenal educator. By effectively employing games and simulations, such as CFR's model diplomacy simulations and role-playing the National Security Council, as well as being perpetually open to new methods of teaching IR, Professor Koch has inspired countless students here at CMC. She's also been faculty advisor for the Alexander Hamilton Society campus chapter since 2021, which has been a great new vehicle for students to explore and deeply engage with a variety of global issues. But don't just take my word for it. She won the 2023 Glenn R. Huntoon Award for Superior Teaching by popular vote of the student body, and, while this is admittedly slightly less representative, boasts an incredible 5 out of 5 rating on ratemyprofessors.com. With 100% of students on there saying they would take a course with her again. Really trustworthy site. Among many other topics, Professor Haley also specialized in nuclear safety and arms control. So it is quite fitting that tonight Professor Koch will speak from her own deep expertise to address such complex and nuanced issues that the nuclear age presents. Specifically, she will discuss the role of nuclear threats in conflict, drawing on both old and new case studies so as to contextualize the implications of such threats for warfare and international relations going forward. Professor Koch's lecture tonight is co-sponsored by the Keck Center for International and Strategic Studies and the McGrulian Center for Human Rights. As a quick reminder before we begin, please silence and put away your cell phones. As always in the Ath, video and audio recording is strictly prohibited, and we have an incredible speaker on home turf tonight, so please be present and get ready to engage in constructive dialogue. Welcome to the Athenaeum, and please join me in welcoming Professor Lisa Koch.
Well, thank you so much, Adrian, for that kind and very generous introduction. And I want to thank all of you for being here tonight to celebrate Professor Ed Haley's legacy and to engage in a conversation about international politics in Ed's honor. Soon after the IR program started at CMC, the number of IR majors, and when I say IR, I mean international relations, numbered from about half a dozen to a dozen a year, which is quite a substantial number for a brand new major. Ed and a couple of colleagues, like Professor Bill Rood, were the core faculty. When I spoke to Professor Charlie Lofgren about Ed's role, he described Ed as the driving force behind the IR program. Professor John Roth, who counts Ed as his very close friend of 55 years, told me about Ed's leadership in building a rich environment for the study of international relations at CMC right from the start of his career here. From playing a key role in launching formal study abroad to bringing distinguished speakers to campus, including here at the Ath. And John used the same phrase Charlie did, driving force, in describing Ed's stewardship of the international relations major. Ed shepherded the IR program from its infancy to its development into the dynamic and robust program it remains today. He did so while educating students with a classroom style Professor Jenny Todd describes as both priceless and rare. She shared with me the reflections that Hillary brought up as well, that Ed would bring his rich and varied interests into the classroom, and he would illuminate connections among the arts and sciences and politics so that students gained a deeper understanding of how today's political events are situated in complex histories. And here's how Ed's program has grown. By 1980, the IR program was becoming more established. 6 students graduated as IR majors, and that was approximately 4% of the graduating class that year. Now it's routinely the case that about 10% of the graduating class has majored in IR. And of course, many of our government majors also choose to concentrate their coursework in IR. We now have a dozen faculty in the IR program who offer about 30 courses each year, and some years educating over 500 students. Our courses span the globe and cover topics from international political economy to democracy, to international law, to natural resource policy, to war, to migration, to the politics of development. And our IR alumni have gone on to graduate programs all over the world and work in many different fields. And those students are the best evidence of what Ed's vision and hard work have brought about. I was not lucky enough to meet Ed here before he retired, but I have gotten to know Ed through his writings. That's how scholars get to know each other. It's through our work. And so I get to enter into conversation with Ed when I read and engage with his words. I brought his book, Strategies of Dominance, with me. I checked it out of our library. And it's a great example of Ed's scholarship. It is pragmatic and it is clear-eyed. It is grounded in historical case studies, and it is forward-looking. It is policy-focused, and it is tinged with optimism. In an interview with Professor Wendy Lauer, Ed spoke about how we have the opportunity to look back, as your poem, as Blythe's reading of Ed's poem reminded us today, and then to look forward, to seek to understand and gain insights from the past, and then to look forward, as Ed said, full of hope and energy and idealism. And there was a sentence in here I found particularly representative of Ed's work and ideals. He analyzed the foreign policy strategies of several past US presidents, and in reflecting on what he had learned from that study, he wrote of those presidents, "It is time to turn away from their mistakes and take another path forward." We can learn, we can turn away from old mistakes, we can seek out a new path. I agree with Ed, and it's my privilege to be able to honor him tonight with this talk. I'll just mention before I begin the talk that more than once at alumni events, I've met Ed's former students, and whenever they hear what I research and teach, they share with me how much they learned from Ed about the role of nuclear weapons in international politics and how fascinating they found his courses. For this talk in Ed's honor, I chose a topic, nuclear threats, that was important during Ed's long career and has generated renewed interest today. Because of declassified documents and the work of historians and political scientists, we know more now than we used to about how nuclear threats and promises have played out across the nuclear age. So tonight, we are going to look back to look forward. But we will not have all the answers. And that means this is not only an important topic, but it is also a fascinating one. Now, I mentioned there is renewed interest in the topic of nuclear threats today. And that is due in large part to Russian leader Vladimir Putin's nuclear threats, which he has made in the context of the Russian war in Ukraine. He delivered a speech on February 24th, 2022, the day of the Russian invasion. It's a lengthy speech that includes many historical references and attempts to justify Russia's war. Toward the very end, Putin turns his attention specifically to his enemies. And he says, I would now like to say something very important for those who may be tempted to interfere. No matter who tries to stand in our way or creates threats for our country and our people, they must know that Russia will respond immediately. And the consequences will be such as you have never seen in your entire history. No matter how the events unfold, we are ready. All the necessary decisions have been taken. I hope my words will be heard. Now, he does not use the word nuclear in that speech, but I can certainly interpret his threat to mean nuclear. What else could somebody be referring to? You don't even need to use the word to inspire the fear. Why are these veiled threats so scary? It's because nuclear weapons are so scary. And here's an image of the thermonuclear fire you may have heard of, or seen photos or videos of, or lived through the testing of. This image is from the 1954 Castle Bravo test conducted by the United States near the Marshall Islands. This weapon is a thermonuclear weapon. If the image evokes the fireball of the sun for you, then you are on the right track. A thermonuclear weapon is fueled by the same fusion reaction that powers our sun, fusing hydrogen nuclei into helium, which releases a tremendous amount of energy. That process of hydrogen fusion is why we call thermonuclear weapons H-bombs or hydrogen bombs. And I want to show you something to help us understand the scale of nuclear weapons, because they are outside the context that we encounter in daily life, and they are hard for us to comprehend without some help. This graph, if you take a look at the square, you'll see the y-axis goes up to 50. The unit is megatons. This is describing the explosive yield of a bomb. Mega means million, so it is counting in terms of millions of tons. If you look at the circle, it's like a magnifying glass that's drawing out the tiny little specks in that bottom left corner. They're too small for us to see. So already this gives us a sense of scale. So in that tiny corner, we have a little nub in the bottom labeled bunker buster. Those range from 10 to 15 tons. They are the largest non-nuclear bombs the world has. The United States has different types of bunker busters, so depending on which one, they range from 10 to 15 tons of explosive power. Now, next to the bunker buster is the mushroom cloud associated with the attack on Hiroshima. And that bomb was named Little Boy. Little Boy had an explosive yield of 15,000 tons. All right, so the most powerful non-nuclear weapon, about 15 tons. The earliest, most primitive nuclear weapon was 1,000 times larger, yet it was deliverable by a B-29 bomber. You cannot load a bomber with 15,000 tons of anything, because that's 30 million pounds. But you can build a bomb like Little Boy that weighs only several thousand pounds. That's deliverable by aircraft. Today, a bomb with that yield could be built that weighs only a few hundred pounds and can fit on a missile. And therein lies the appeal of nuclear weapons. You don't even have to put a flight crew at risk to bring a single bomb to its target that has the explosive power of 1,000 bunker busters. So Little Boy and Trinity, next to it here, Trinity, the first nuclear test conducted during the Manhattan Project, were fission bombs. Now we can move to the square on our right, because these are the hydrogen bombs. So when you zoom out, you now obtain a sense of the power of hydrogen bombs, the bombs that remind us of our sun. You can look at the first ever tested hydrogen bomb, Ivy Mike, at 10.4 megatons, and remember, mega is million. Castle Bravo, which is the image we saw a moment ago, at 15 megatons. That's 1,000 times bigger than the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima. And then this dramatically large mushroom cloud, Tsar Bomba, which was tested by the Soviet Union in 1961. This is the largest nuclear weapon ever tested. It doesn't mean it's the largest one it's possible to make, but after this, no one dared try anything larger. Its yield was 50 megatons. It was 10 times more powerful than all of the conventional munitions used in World War II. One bomb. Its fireball was almost 6 miles in diameter. The mushroom cloud rose 42 miles high. That's more than 7 times the height of Mount Everest. It rose above the stratosphere. The shock wave that the blast created circled the Earth. The flash was visible 621 miles away. And to put that in perspective, that's as if we looked east right now and could see something that had just happened in Albuquerque, New Mexico. This kind of power is why nuclear threats get their own category and why they are so frightening. Nuclear threats and promises are like the most dangerous and terrible game of chess, because if somebody makes the wrong move, the consequences would be horrific. So countries make nuclear promises, like, we won't use our nuclear weapons first, or we will only use our nuclear weapons if it is the last resort. But how do I know when we've reached the last resort? And no promise is unbreakable. So the question becomes, is someone actually willing to accept the consequences of breaking the nuclear promise? Breaking a nuclear promise would incur severe consequences, and what they might be may not be entirely clear. We will come back to that. But they could include nuclear retaliation. So what about nuclear threats? Interestingly, overt nuclear threats are very rare. So that fact in itself might be surprising. Like in Putin's speech, nuclear is implied, it is not spoken. There are different types of nuclear threats. There could be a deterrent threat that is made, a threat like this. If you do this thing that I don't want you to do, then I will punish you by using nuclear weapons against you. There could be a compellent threat. I'm going to use my nuclear weapons unless you stop doing the thing I don't like. So one is meant to prevent, and the other is meant to change the behavior. In either case, there is a promise on the other side. The promise is, if you act the way I want you to, I won't use the nuclear weapons. But again, promises can be broken. Now, leaders in most countries rarely issue nuclear threats, as I've already said. And when they do, they are usually veiled. It's like everybody has agreed to talk in euphemisms or in code. Why? Why do that? If we all know you're talking about nuclear weapons, why not just say it? It seems partly because it's viewed as irresponsible. Legitimate governments, legitimate leaders, powerful countries just don't behave that way. And it seems partly because it's risky. It raises the stakes. The nuclear threat escalates the conflict to a different level. It makes people jumpy. It raises the risk of miscalculation or accident because emotions are running high. And when we're feeling scared, we tend to react in ways we wouldn't have if we were feeling calm. People, after all, are only human. They make mistakes. But you saw how dangerous these weapons are. That's why they would be useful for a threat. That's why they would be useful to deter, to prevent someone else from using them. Because the penalty for nuclear use would be so great. But what if they are actually too dangerous to be useful in a threat? Meaning, what if they are so big and so deadly that no one could possibly believe any leader would actually authorize a nuclear launch to fulfill the threat? In that case, nuclear threats are actually empty. They're just cheap talk. They're not credible. What if nuclear threats are viewed as bluffs? Does it seem like the leader issuing the threat would actually consider the dispute at hand to constitute a vital enough interest, to risk the existence of their country by fulfilling a nuclear threat? Are the costs really worth it to the leader or to the state? Now, leaders know this. They know that nuclear threats are seen as empty. They know that people immediately think it's probably a bluff. And so they have to think about how to make those threats more believable, how to make them credible. And one way appears to be to try to come across as rational and sober, not to issue the threat publicly, but to do it through back channels, to signal that this isn't just public bluster aimed at my public domestic audience, but that I really mean it. Another way is to act irrational. Richard Nixon is famous for attempting to do this. We know today, based on archives that have been declassified, that he actually wasn't successful because he sent mixed signals. He would send a nuclear threat, but at the same time would send a message of reassurance, and so his threats weren't received the way he intended them to be. But you could do that to show no rational person would ever do this, but I'm not a rational person myself. But another way is to actually do something risky, to demonstrate that your interest is sincere. Like put your nuclear forces on high alert. Like fuel your bombers, load them with bombs, and position them on the runways ready to go. And make sure you do this where everyone can see you do it. So those are signals. There are different ways to send threats. You can speak them, but you can also try to send signals to demonstrate your threat isn't empty, that if you're willing to inch closer to an actual nuclear war by doing something like putting your nuclear forces on hair trigger alert with all the risks that come with that, then maybe you're also willing to carry out your nuclear threat. Thomas Schelling described this as a threat that leaves something to chance. Things could spiral out of control if we keep heading down this path. Are you sure you want to keep going? Leaving something to chance could help solve the credibility problem. It may be too hard to believe someone will intentionally launch nuclear weapons, so instead one could manipulate the risk of miscalculation and generate fear in the adversary that we could all accidentally end up on the brink of a nuclear war that no one ever wanted. It's hard to know what leaders' intentions are when they issue these threats. And leaders rarely reveal their true beliefs and intentions, even in their memoirs, because they want to show themselves in the best possible light. But sometimes we can try to figure it out from declassified meeting memos or correspondence. And so looking to the past can help us try to untangle why leaders would or wouldn't use nuclear threats and promises. And I think they can help us approach Putin's threats and promises over the last almost 2 years from a broader context of leaders' behavior in the age of nuclear weapons. And so I'd like to examine a case of nuclear threats during a border conflict between the Soviet Union and China. A long-held dispute over where to draw the border heated up in the 1960s until it escalated to the point of nuclear threats in 1969. So we're first going to take a look at these two leaders shown here in 1958, Mao Zedong of China and Nikita Khrushchev of the USSR. These two leaders did not care much for each other personally, but each believed for a time that his country would benefit from an alliance with the other. Now in 1950, the Soviet Union had begun significant nuclear assistance to China, and in 1955 committed to help China develop nuclear weapons. But the relationship between the countries began to deteriorate for many reasons, including different strategic perspectives that were at odds with each other. And by 1958, Khrushchev had changed his mind and secretly canceled Soviet nuclear weapons assistance. But Mao Zedong, the Chinese leader, was not notified. Instead, Soviet scientists were directed to start deceiving Chinese scientists, providing them with bad technology and faulty equipment that would slow their progress. China believed the Soviet Union planned to deliver a prototype bomb to China by rail. The Soviet scientists drew up false train schedules, and then the false schedules were delayed again and again. At last, Soviet scientists started leaving to go on vacation. They never returned. And finally, a letter was written in June 1959 and delivered to China's leadership. It began heartily. The greeting was, "Dear comrades," with an exclamation point. But the rest of the letter was not as hearty, and it concluded with a gentle paragraph explaining that the Soviet Union would be very happy to continue to help China with its nuclear energy pursuits, but it would not be able to provide further weapons assistance. This was a very serious blow to the relationship. And so the border conflict in the 1960s takes place within this larger context. The modern border dispute really begins in 1963. This was a border in Manchuria. Secret negotiations failed in 1964. Also in 1964, China successfully tests its first nuclear weapon, and by 1967 has successfully tested a hydrogen bomb. So by the point when the border conflict goes from skirmishes to actual open armed conflict, both countries were nuclear weapons powers. Oh, I'll do that in a moment. I'm getting ahead of myself. So in March of 1969, the open armed conflict was initiated by Chinese soldiers and resulted in a humiliating battle defeat for Soviet border forces. Days later, the Soviet troops attacked, and this time it was China suffering a humiliating loss, with several hundred Chinese soldiers dead. By mid-March, the Soviet Union put its strategic rocket forces in the Far East on high alert. Those are its nuclear forces. So there's signal number one. Then the Soviet premier, who at this time was Alexei Kosygin, called Mao to invite him to negotiations, and Mao wouldn't even take his call. The operator hung up on him. Mao rejected several other invitations that followed. Chinese troops were making gains along the border, and Mao believed that the Soviet Union wouldn't escalate the war any further. But he was wrong, because the Soviet Union decided to play the nuclear card to try to gain the upper hand. Leaders hoped that nuclear threats would not escalate dangerously, but would inspire caution and cause China to back down. And so they issued different types of nuclear threats that spring and summer. There were radio broadcasts issued from Moscow warning China about the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal, how superior it was to China's nuclear arsenal, and reminding them that bombs could be delivered using the strategic rocket forces, which, by the way, were on high alert. The Soviet Union built airfields in nearby Mongolia, near the disputed areas. And Soviet bomber units were redeployed from Eastern Europe to these bases and to others in Central Asia. They conducted war games and simulated possible attacks against China. Soviet bomber units in Siberia and Mongolia actually practiced conducting mock nuclear strikes against mock targets representing Chinese nuclear facilities. The United States noticed this, China noticed this, and of course that was the intention. The threat was received. They also used words. A Soviet diplomat, who really we know now was a KGB agent under diplomatic cover, had lunch with an American diplomat. And in that lunch, he used the language of diplomacy to issue a threat by asking a question. Hypothetically, what if the Soviet Union were to attack and destroy China's nuclear installations? What would the United States do? Well, the American diplomat, as you can imagine, ran right back to the State Department and immediately let everyone know that in the language of diplomacy, Moscow was saying, this is what we plan to do. We plan to conduct a first strike against China with nuclear weapons. China learned of this as well immediately, and Mao got scared. And he warned the border regions to be prepared to fight a war. We now know, and this is only very recently that we know this, that the United States in September of that year, 1969, sent a message to Zhu Enlai, the Chinese premier, through a high-level Romanian official, and said, we want to normalize relations between the United States and China, and we won't support the Soviet Union in its war against you. Chinese leaders had already concluded that it would be smart to resume negotiations with Moscow because it would help them appear reasonable and responsive and grow closer to Washington. And so they thought, let's pursue negotiations with the United States at the same time we pursue parallel negotiations with Moscow, and we'll play each against the other. So on September 10th, Mao finally approved a meeting between Zhu Enlai and Alexei Kosygin at the Beijing airport. It took place on September 10th, and that's the image you see here. The meeting went well. Within a few weeks, China agreed to return to the talks with no conditions attached. So what can we learn from what happened? Because it would appear, if we didn't know about the role the United States played, it would appear that the Soviet Union issued multiple nuclear threats, and then China, in response, backed down and came to the negotiating table. But it is only through these recently opened archives that we know that it was due to the mediation of the United States that China agreed to return to the talks. And so the first thing we take away from this is we have to be very cautious when we assume that because A came first and B came second, therefore A caused B. That's not necessarily true. And I'll speak in a moment very briefly about how we can interpret Putin's threats today and the US response to Putin's threats, and try and be cautious about assigning cause and effect to things that happen first and then second when we don't actually have evidence that one has caused the other. We also have a lot of evidence that China thought the threats were empty. The United States intelligence community's assessment was the same. The Soviet Union is bluffing. But even so, there were times when Mao panicked. At one point, he directed citizens to dig shelters and stockpile food. At another point, just days before a round of talks began on October 20th, he ordered government leaders to evacuate Beijing just in case the Soviet Union conducted a surprise nuclear strike to decapitate the government. We do not have enough information to determine exactly why Mao panicked when he did. But we know that overall, complex strategic reasoning prevailed in determining China's response. So today, we have nuclear threats. These were the Soviet soldiers I was looking for. Here are the Soviet soldiers at the border. It's cold up there. We have the nuclear threats from 2017 and 2018 between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un, which we can look back on now and say, well, those were probably bluffs. Was either leader really willing to risk their country over a war of words? They were probably bluffs, but I don't know that for sure. We won't know for a long time. What do we make of Putin and his threats today, and what do we make of the US response? I'm going to show you a lengthy statement he makes, but I only want to draw your attention to one part of it. It was a nuclear threat that he issued in September. And the part that I've circled is when he says out loud, he says the quiet part out loud. He literally says, this is not a bluff. If you have to say, this is not a bluff, that's not a good sign. The US response has been really interesting. President Biden has spoken publicly in ways that indicate that he thinks that Putin wouldn't dare actually use nuclear weapons. But he also makes the threat in return and says if he does dare, horrible and terrible things will happen to him. But he's very careful not to say what those things will be. And this is the behavior we observe when leaders issue these threats and respond to them. Nobody wants to say exactly what will happen. Leave a little something to the imagination. And don't tell someone exactly where the line is that they would need to cross for you to do something, because then they might walk right up to it. And so I don't know how much the conversation in the White House would have revolved around those early questions in those early months of Putin's mental status, of his health status. There was rampant speculation in Western media that he was dying, that he was insane. I don't know whether American officials discussed that in any seriousness, but it probably benefited Putin because it was distracting. And it made the threats seem more credible. Maybe he's mad. Maybe he might actually do the thing that no one should actually do. The nuclear threats have died down, and Putin even said that he wouldn't, use nuclear weapons. He issued that statement in direct contradiction to his others. And so we can use history as our guide to try to conclude that the threats were probably a bluff, but we don't know. We're probably right. But if we're wrong, we're really, really wrong. The probability of a nuclear strike can never be zero. There is always something left to chance, in Schelling's words. And that's why nuclear threats are frightening. And that's why they constrain the actions even of other nuclear weapons powers, like the United States. And so before I ask you for your questions, I'll leave you with the last image, and this is an image from 1969, appropriately. It's a mural painted by a Japanese artist, Toshiko Okamoto. It is called The Myth of Tomorrow, and it is on permanent display in a rail station in Tokyo so that the public may encounter it. It depicts the moment in which a nuclear bomb explodes. The artist intended to depict not only the tragedy of a nuclear attack, but also to remind us that people are capable of overcoming fear and devastation to look forward toward the myth of tomorrow, what tomorrow may be. And so too, it's our responsibility to look back, but to do it in order to look forward, to understand nuclear threats in their historical context and not to dismiss them, but not to be paralyzed by them either. Instead, to look for solutions and act with resolve to stop escalation and to reduce nuclear risk. And so in other words, there is hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your lovely talk, Professor Koch. We'll now move into the Q&A portion of the evening. So if you have a question for Professor Koch, please line up on one of the two walls. When you ask your question, please introduce yourself, say your name, what school you're from, what year you are, what your major is, and please keep your questions short, roughly 1 to 2 sentences, and refrain from follow-ups. Looking forward to hearing all of your questions.
Hi, I'm Chad McElroy. I'm a sophomore here studying government, and my question revolves around the question of tactical nuclear weapons. So as you discussed earlier, a lot that goes into the discussion about nuclear threats comes in the sense of how do you show your resolve and how do you show that a country is serious about that threat? And I wonder what your take is about tactical nuclear weapons as they come into the context of showing that, these threats are serious, that how they play into things such as back-channel negotiations, how they play into the threats themselves, or even warfighting on its own.
Chad, that is a great question. It's something I think about a lot in this context. So, and I'm going to use the term low-yield nuclear weapons because I know you know this, Chad. Tactical is a description of how the weapons would be used, say on a battlefield rather than launched across an ocean. But the important part of this question is that a tactical nuclear weapon, or I'll say a low-yield nuclear weapon, is significantly smaller than even the weapon that was used to attack Hiroshima. Now, it's not small. So a low-yield nuclear weapon, instead of 15 kilotons of explosive power, would yield, say, 6,000 or 7,000 tons of explosive power. that is still orders of magnitude larger than the largest non-nuclear weapon that exists. So what is the point? There is little battlefield use for nuclear weapons. Even the smallest ones are simply too big or don't add the military value to win the battle that you would want them to have. But the reason several countries today are seriously thinking about expanding the low-yield nuclear weapons in their arsenals, one of the reasons is they worry that their nuclear threats are not credible because nuclear weapons are too big and too destructive. And so the logic goes, well, then what if I had smaller nuclear weapons? Maybe then someone might believe I would use them because I would not bring about annihilation. Now, the problem with this line of thinking is you are a bit out on a limb making that assumption because there has never been a nuclear exchange. The only time nuclear weapons were used in war was by the United States in 1945, and there was no other nuclear weapons power at that time. And so nobody knows what happens if somebody uses a low-yield nuclear weapon. Will the response be nuclear or not? That level of uncertainty is not something most leaders are comfortable with. And yet, they face the dilemma that their deterrent threats that they hope maintain stability and prevent any nuclear use at all are simply not believable without them. We do not know the answer. We don't know which way the scales balance and whether the use of a low-yield weapon would escalate to wider nuclear war. But that would be the risk that would be entailed.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor Koch. My name is Adrian. I'm a junior here. I study IR and public policy. So I know that the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists publishes a doomsday clock on nuclear threat, and I'm curious as to your perspective as a political scientist and in the context of threats and promises. What's the utility of that metric of nuclear threat? Should people be checking that as some sort of thermometer on global attitudes towards nuclear weapons use?
So I personally have a fondness for the doomsday clock. About 20 years ago, I was in Chicago, where the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists is housed, and it is in a house near the University of Chicago. And I stopped by, and I asked the folks at the front desk if I might visit the doomsday clock, and they looked very confused. I don't think anyone had ever asked them that. And they took me upstairs, and it was sitting on the floor next to the pool table. And I was a little disheartened to see that. The doomsday clock figures into popular imagination because it's a visual that we have. And the atomic scientists choose where to move the minute hand, how many minutes to midnight. The closer it is to midnight, the closer we are to doomsday is the idea. I think the doomsday clock is a powerful image. It captures our imagination. I think over the last 10 to 15 years, the minute hand has hovered so close to midnight, there's little distinction from year to year. And so I don't think it gives us useful information anymore because the hand remains simply so close to midnight. I don't get enough variation. I don't get enough information about where we might be. But I love the doomsday clock. I'm glad it exists, and it serves to remind us of the consequences that exist with a nuclear exchange.
Hello, I'm Charlie. I'm a sophomore at CMC. Thank you for your talk. I was wondering how these interactions between states might change if one state has second strike capabilities and another state might not.
So what Charlie means by second strike capabilities, for anyone not familiar with the term, is that another country would possess the ability to retaliate after their enemy has launched the first nuclear strike. If the enemy can launch a first nuclear strike as the Soviet Union was threatening to do against China in 1969. And they feel that they could eliminate, destroy all of the country's nuclear weapons. Well, then there is no deterrence at work anymore. There is no terrible consequence. If the Soviet Union could wipe out China's entire nuclear arsenal, there is no terrible consequence that China can impose. And so countries work hard, if they have chosen to go down the path of building a nuclear arsenal, to make sure that there is at least a significant risk that a second strike capability would remain. The best second strike capability is nuclear-propelled submarines that don't need to surface for air. They can travel under the oceans of the world. If they are armed with nuclear-tipped missiles, nobody knows how to find them. And so you can never guarantee that you have eliminated the enemy's second strike. But you don't need that gold standard to have the risk of second strike. Really, all you need to do is the kind of thing North Korea does. Once in a while, you load nuclear-tipped missiles onto trains, and you pilot them around the countryside through forests, and no one is quite sure where they might be and if the satellite imagery is up to date or not. And so even though you might have a small arsenal and your enemy might have plenty of nuclear weapons to try to eliminate your arsenal, your enemy can't be sure they've got them all. And the idea is all you need to have left is one or two. That's one or two cities. And so those interactions are profoundly influenced by that second strike, because that's the threat that remains and stays the hand, theoretically, of the nuclear attacker.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Madeline. I'm a junior at CMC studying government. So my question, okay, let me think about how to phrase this. What are your thoughts on the idea that nuclear weapons make the world like a safer place? If we think about kind of the international order, do you think that like zero nuclear weapons, if we get to that point, or how like countries start to reduce their nuclear weapons or destroy them, is that kind of, does that create like a more unbalanced world where the likelihood of conflict is higher? Or do you think that there is some security in like most countries or a lot of countries having nuclear weapons, so each country is deterred in some way from using them?
Yeah, that is a question that has inspired decades of debate. And I do not think we have the answer given the evidence we have today. The number one answer for why nuclear weapons have made the world safer, what evidence do we have to prove that, is that there has never been a World War III. As Einstein famously said, the next World War would be fought with sticks and stones. World War III would be fought with nuclear weapons. World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones, meaning that's all that would be left. But it's hard to prove a negative. There hasn't been a third world war. Is that due to the presence of nuclear weapons? Is that due to the deterrent power of the arsenals? Maybe, but I'm not sure. I can't be sure why something hasn't happened. But it seems likely that that has been an important factor. The question is security that the nuclear balance might bring. It's security for whom? Does it secure the world and protect the world from the kind of annihilation that was visited upon the world by the Great War and the Second World War? It seems probable, but I see a lot of insecurity under that strategic layer. If you ask the people of Ukraine if they think nuclear weapons have brought stability to the world, I think they'd say the opposite. I think they'd say nuclear weapons emboldened Russia to invade our country because they know nobody dares come to our aid directly because of the threat of nuclear weapons. So they may provide stability at one level, but in a paradox, they may generate stability at another level.
Thank you.
Hey, Professor. Thank you for your talk. I'm James, and I'm a sophomore. I wanted to ask about no first use policies. So it seems like there already is a de facto no first use policy from what you've said, that everyone agrees that it would be bad if they got nuked, and nuclear threats aren't that credible or are hard to make credible. Yet countries seem to pursue kind of risky and dangerous ways to make nuclear threats credible that might trigger miscalculation, like fueling bombers or putting nukes on high alert. So I'm wondering why, if it seems like we have a de facto no first use policy, and outlining that might seem to be stabilizing, countries still hang on to like being able to threaten to use nukes or preemptive strikes.
And James, just to make sure, by the way, A+ summary of the talk. So yes, just to make sure I understand the question. So you're wondering why would it be necessary to write down and specify a no first use policy, or why don't more countries do it?
Yeah, I'm wondering why more countries don't do it.
Great. So no first use policies are rare, which is the foundation of your question. A no first use policy is a promise. We will never use nuclear weapons first. Now, we tend to think of no first use policies as absolute. We will never use nuclear weapons first, no matter what. But every no first use policy, and these policies can evolve over time, if written down, includes caveats. We will definitely not use nuclear weapons first unless the country has been invaded, they're marching on the Capitol, and our leadership is about to be decapitated. In that case, maybe so. Why don't more countries just adopt a policy like that? Wouldn't that reassure others that these countries do not plan to use nuclear weapons aggressively? They do not plan to leverage them as threats to obtain what they want from others. This is an ongoing debate. In particular, it's transparent in the United States. You can read publications from within the military, from within the national laboratories that design and build nuclear weapons, where people are debating, shouldn't we just go ahead and say this? And I think what holds a lot of countries back is the fear that the more specific they get, the more they are showing where the line is. And the more they worry that that invites their enemies to tiptoe right up to the line, but not cross it. And if you don't make that promise so specific, the idea would be it gives you more autonomy to act. Now, any country has total autonomy to act in any way it wants. But we can see it in the issuing of threats as well. It seems that leaders really value the vague and the unspecific because they feel they have more ability to negotiate, to bargain, and to inspire fear. So I think ultimately it is the psychology of it.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Daniela. I'm a sophomore at CMC studying international relations and psychology. And my question is, has public perception on nuclear weapons changed the way we talk about nuclear weapons over time? And I especially wonder if you think that the release of the movie Oppenheimer has changed the way we view nuclear weapons today.
Yeah, so that's something that I wonder about, and it's a question that I ask in different ways in some of my research. I think that no one here will be surprised to hear me say, I think there are generational differences in how the public perceives nuclear weapons, their meaning, their threat. It is unusual for your generation to feel existential dread the way people would have 2 generations ago. And so I think that's good. I don't want people to feel existential dread. I think that's paralyzing. On the other hand, I think that because each successive generation knows less about what the weapons can do, that people may treat the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons more cavalierly than they should, or not take them as seriously as they should. And I think as we have successive generations of leaders now coming into high office, I worry that the perception is not what I would want it to be for people to be properly afraid. And I do think the movie Oppenheimer could be somewhat of a corrective to that on the margins. I think that while the movie is not perfect, it is based on a scholarly biography that's been sitting on my shelf for years. So I thought that was fantastic. And I think that people who have seen this movie, at least from what folks have told me, who are getting their first introduction to nuclear weapons by seeing this movie, they do come away with the awe and the respect that I think is healthy to have.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Anson, and I'm a sophomore studying economics. So it seems, or from this talk, it seems to me like it's unlikely that countries will use nuclear weapons in, or at least in a hostile way, because of mutual assured destruction. But what do you think of methods to ensure that accidental uses of nuclear weapons are reduced? We already talked earlier about the clock to midnight and how we're just minutes away from it, from an accident spawning, I guess, a nuclear reaction. So how do you think countries could work together globally to ensure that accidents happen less?
I think that's such a great question, not just because it's timely, but because it relates so directly to Professor Haley's work. I think that's just terrific. It's a really important topic. Catherine Murphy, who's a senior here at CMC, is writing her senior thesis right now, partly in response to that question. What could be done today to reduce the risk of accident and to make the fact that nuclear weapons exist, to make that less dangerous for the world? There are things that can be done, but they will require trust. And right now, there is not very much trust among major nuclear weapons powers. There is very little trust between the United States and Russia. There is very little trust between the United States and China. There is very little trust between India and Pakistan. If countries, the trust doesn't have to come first. If countries can agree to build in safeguards at low and basic levels that haven't previously existed, let's say the United States and China agreeing to establish methods of communication that become institutionalized, people who have each other's phone numbers and can easily call to figure out what's going on, why are we observing this. That starting at that level can generate trust over time and can lead to more policies and more measures. So I think we could look to a long history of arms control and of safety methods and of international efforts to work to build trust together to avoid miscalculation. But since that trust ebbs and flows, I think maintaining as many structures as possible and taking the leap of faith to add new structures, even with, and especially with adversaries who are not trusted, is the way to get closer to that level of safety that we would hope to see.
Thank you.
What an excellent Q&A. Please join me in once again thanking Professor Lisa Koch.